Well, now the good news for black, the further good news, if you like playing this line with knight h6, is that black might not be forced to give up his dark square bishop so readily. So let's turn to the game Ferguson versus Turner, which was played in the Oakham Masters in 1994. At the time, I think both of these players were international masters. Matthew Turner has since gone on to become a grandmaster. He seems to like this line with black, and we quickly reach a familiar position after bishop e2, when black actually delays the move f5 by playing d6 first. White plays knight c3, black castles, white castles, reaching a typical position, and only now does black play f5. And the point of this move is that when white takes on f5, black's going to recapture with the knight. So this is much less committal than the bishop takes d4 line, but perhaps black is playing for less high stakes in this line. We're going to reach a position after knight takes f5, bishop takes f5, where really this position is a question of taste. Strategical white players might like the slightly better white pawn structure, and the fact that, you know, black's light squares in the centre are slightly weakened, but tacticians are going to like black's raking bishops and the prospect of putting pressure on white's queen side, notably on b2. Ferguson's a very good strategical player, so it's interesting to see Turner adopting this line against him. So white played queen d2. Black brought his rook into the game with rook c8, knight d5 by white, and now black plays e6. This, to my mind, is a very practical variation by black. Black plays this line when he wants to win games. It really is as simple as that. You don't play this line to make a short draw. It's an unbalanced position. It's very, very sharp, and you play it when you need to play flat out for a win. Ferguson didn't like the idea of retreating his knight straight away and played bishop g5. White forces black to find a location for the queen. I think queen d7 is the best, in fact the only location, and knight e3 was the point of white's move. So white is going to obtain the bishop on f5. Yes, but black gets his stronghold on d4. It seems to be a theme in this variation to try and push white's dark square bishop out of position, after which black hopes to make a gain in the centre, maybe even to conquer the d4 square for good. Ferguson took on f5, black took on e2, and after queen takes e2, rook takes f5. At every stage in this line, black is keeping white at bay with tactical chances. White retreats his bishop to e3, and now black gets on the case with b5. C takes b5. Queen takes b5. Queen takes, rook takes, and white played rook a d1. Well, clearly this is a critical position, and as white has no really effective way to defend that pawn on b2, bishop takes a7 has to be another possibility. I'm sure against that black was going rook a8, bishop e3, and now bishop takes b2. Well, this is an unclear position, perhaps rook a d1, but now I think d5, and white has some problems with his pawn on a2. So you see, it's not that easy for white to avoid slipping in to some sort of bad endgame in this position, simply because black is so active. So in the game, going back to the position in the game, Ferguson played rook a d1, and rook takes b2 was the move. We've got a different version of the last endgame here, where it was actually black who obtained a passed a pawn rather than white. Rook a8. So everything's going to hinge on whether, you know, white has enough activity to actually prevent black from just pushing that a pawn all the way up the board. It's very convenient for black that the queening square is on the same colour as his bishop on g7. That bishop on g7 is ideally placed. First, white has to do a little bit of tidying up at the back, so he plays g4 to let his king out more than anything else, and black starts the pawn rolling. Nothing complicated about what black's doing in this position. He's just pushing that pawn for all it's worth. So white, having given his king some room, brings his rook to c1, and he wants to play his rook to c7. That's completely clear. So bishop f8, both attacking the rook, gaining time, and preventing white himself gaining time after rook c7. Rook d7 was answered by a3. This is black's default plan in this position, just pushing that a pawn if he can't see any direct threats by white. In comes the white rook. Rook e2, getting ready to push the pawn even further, and Ferguson plays rook a7, which I'm sure is correct, getting his rook in behind the passed pawn. But on with the show. King f1, rook b2, and now here's the move White is relying on. Bishop d4. White is seriously hoping that this move is going to save the day. Well, we will see. Rook d2. An excellent tactical move, nudging the bishop out of position. The bishop is actually curiously overloaded here, defending both against the pawn advance and a tactic on the f2 square, which we're going to see coming up as after bishop c3, black unleashes rook takes f2 check. That was the point of the whole idea, and white went king e1, a rather miserable move, but of course if he goes king takes f2, bishop c5 check, king e2, bishop takes a7, and I think this bishop ending should be fairly comfortably won. White's problem is he's got to look after the pawn on a2. This is going to enable the black king to come into the centre and hopefully eventually to invade on white's king side. The white king can't really defend against, once the black king gets to d5, black's twin threat of coming into the king side and just marching up to the queen side to prepare the advance of the pawn. This will be a lost endgame for white. So going back to rook takes f2, king e1 was played, but another pawn goes down the drain. And now it's hard to imagine that white is going to save this position, 2 pawns down, despite the fact that the black king is as yet to enter the fray. g5, very good. Point of this, bishop takes g5, bishop g7. There's also a1 equals queen. This perhaps is more convincing. The skewer wins. So, king d1, h6, bishop c3, bishop c5, black's gradually pushing white back, rook a6, bishop f4, anchoring the bishop. The slow, steady, methodical process, but inexorable. Eventually white has to let the king out. Well, I think black's simply threatening to win that pawn on g4, and then he'll have 2 pawns against 0 on the king side, which again should be a fairly simple win. But there's no problem with time in an endgame like this. You know, black's got all the time in the world, and so he tortures white for a few moves. He keeps him at the board. You know, he keeps him guessing as to his intentions, and you know, white gets more and more fed up with his position. Eventually, makes a decisive mistake. Not that this position isn't lost anyway, but letting the king out makes it easier, of course. King e1, bishop d2 check. That's a nice move to finish off. White was really running out of ideas here. You might say, well, he doesn't need to play king e1. Okay, you're right, but then what else does he play? Black is certainly going to find rook g2 and then rook takes g4, given enough time. But king e1 is game over. Bishop d2 check, and again the bishop's overloaded. White resigns. Bishop takes d2. Well, we just give a check and queen the pawn. Very simple. So let's go on to take another look at this line where black plays f5 and takes on f5 with the knight. It seems very reasonable. Let's go on now to take another look at that line where black delayed the move f5 for a little while. He played d6 first. And the next game comes from the Ukrainian Championship, Kiev, in 1958. And it shows the effect, really, of casual play by white. Playing white in this game is a guy called Stolyarov, playing black the famous grandmaster Yefim Geller. Black played d6, white played knight c3, typical Maroczy stuff, and now Geller played his knight out to h6. White played bishop e2. Note that black is probably thinking about going knight g4 in this position, so bishop e2 is a must. Both sides castle, and now black breaks with f5, reaching the typical position for this line. Okay, white takes, black recaptures with the knight, preferring not to surrender his dark square bishop, although that has advantages too. White takes on f5, bishop takes f5, queen d2, and now Geller brought his queen out to a5. This is another interesting way of deploying the queen in this line. Rook a c1. You know, when you look at that move, you think, well, is black really threatening bishop takes c3 in this position? Sometimes he is, sometimes he isn't. I would say black's plan in this position is probably rook f7 and then rook a f8, with chances along the f-file. But white decides to cut the idea out of bishop takes c3 at any point by playing rook a c1, another standard Maroczy move. And now Geller just gets on with the plan of rook f7, which seems very reasonable. That is, of course, unless white gets a move like c5 and then bishop c4, and black's got to be careful of that idea. But there's no prospect of that just yet. Incidentally, another move that has been played in this position is bishop e6, which takes the idea of c5 right out of white's mind. If then bishop h6, as recommended by Andrew Greet, we take it and we go rook f7. And this seems like a pretty reasonable position for black to me, with rook a f8 coming up. If queen e3, attacking the bishop on e6, then black can play queen e5. Again, with a very reasonable position. White takes, black recaptures, white plays b3, black moves his rook across. What is wrong with black's game here? Nothing as far as I can see. So that may be a reasonable alternative to Geller's rook f7, which incidentally works very well. White went b3, black swung his rook across to f8. You can see the attractions of this line, active play, all pieces in the game. Yes, white has a superior pawn formation, but, you know, black's active play compensates, without any doubt. So Stolyarov moves in to take off the dark square bishop. Black takes, dragging the white queen out of play, and then he plonks his knight in on d4. That's always a drawback for white in this line of giving up the dark square bishop, surrendering the central dark squares. Geller's very quick to notice this, being a connoisseur of fianchetto positions. After queen e3, e5 of course, keeping the knight in there, and bishop f3 was answered by bishop e6, bishop e4, a6, knight e2, and Geller takes on a2. I don't know whether white thought the flurry of tactics coming up was going to favour him. Queen takes d6, but it turns out black can play bishop takes c4, and that's a move I think probably white thought was impossible. Black's main trumps now, of course, are the queenside pawns, especially that passed pawn on a6. White probably thought to himself, well, he can't take on c4 here because I'm going to take on c4 and fork him. But the problem with this continuation is that Geller simply has queen c3 here. And with king g7 coming up, white is running out of steam. Now black has two passed pawns on the queen side, and, well, really, no, white's got nothing to stop them with. So actually, this was the game continuation, and Stolyarov resigned. I don't think black can be prevented from playing king g7. So white will have to take on f7 at some point. Okay, rook takes f7, and what does white have here? Nothing whatsoever. Going back to the critical position in the game, after queen takes d6, bishop takes c4, can white do better? Well, he probably can with rook fe1, and then rook takes f2 is the move that goes for broke. Once again, we see that rook takes c4 isn't working here due to the splendid move rook f1 check. And if rook takes f1, queen e3 check, winning immediately. But I think after rook takes f2, white might be able to do better with queen d4. Sorry, excuse me. Queen d4. Forking the bishop on c4 and the rook on f2. If bishop e6 then, we go bishop f3. That's the point of white's play. Probably best for black now is rook takes f3 and then rook takes f3, braving the complications. White can play rook c7, and I think that forces the pace. Black probably has to go rook g3 check. And after h takes g3, queen takes g3 check. Well, there are two ways of forcing the draw. White's got to play king h1, and then of course queen h3 check forces the draw immediately. We should note that, going back to queen takes g3 check, there are several white pieces on pre. So that has to be taken into consideration. This variation will probably have led to a draw. But as it Stood in the game, bishop takes c4, rook takes, queen takes, bishop d5, queen c3. Just won straight away. So another game where black negotiated the strategical complications and came out on top. Well, we've seen a few games now with this sharp approach. So I think what I'd like to do is just to summarise the theory such as it is on this line. Black should certainly start, in my view, with knight h6 straight away. This gives him the option of playing the line with f5 straight away or playing with d6. White normally plays knight c3 and black castles, reaching the basic position for this line. If bishop e2 by white, then I think black has two options. He can lash out as Spassky did with f5. This is an interesting line and reaches a very dangerous position after e takes f5, bishop takes d4. Bishop takes d4, knight takes f5. I believe this position to be playable for black after bishop c5, d6, bishop a3, and then knight fd4, and follow the Spassky game earlier with bishop f5. Everything hinges on whether white's dark square bishop can be kept out of the game for long enough for black to arrange active play. We saw Spassky doing so with queen d7, rook f7, and rook a f8. I believe this to be a playable position for black. Going back to bishop takes d4, if you play this line, considerably more critical is the line with bishop takes h6. This may amount to a direct refutation of black's idea, but the game remains very sharp. You'll recall in the game Barloff versus Vahy Buck, white castled and black played queen b6, white played knight d5, and now Vahy Buck went in for queen takes b2. When if white finds knight takes e7, and it's not guaranteed that he will, then black's position is not that great. The point of knight takes e7, as you recall, is to overload the black queen. She can't retain her control of the dark squares, and in particular her protection of the bishop on d4. Going back to knight d5, you might have wondered what happens after bishop takes f2 check. Well, once again, the refutation is tactical and quite difficult to see, but it's there. Bishop g4, and now the crushing move, which again people are not guaranteed to find. Knight takes e7 check. This remarkable move actually puts black in a terrible spot, because if he goes knight takes e7, white has a remarkable move, bishop e6. So this variation is interesting, but perhaps rather dodgy from black's point of view. However, you will win lots of games with it. Now, going back to the position after castle, bishop e2, we saw in the Geller game and the Turner game that black could actually delay f5 by playing d6 first, and only now does he play f5. This is a less sharp approach, and black intends to get his knight off the edge by playing knight takes f5 in this position. After knight takes f5, bishop takes f5, it's an open question as to whether white can exploit his advantage of the better pawn structure. That's all he's got in this position because black is very active. After queen d2, black, in my opinion, has two decent moves. He can play queen a5, or going back, he can play as Turner did with rook c8. Either of these moves gives black adequate chances. So there you have it. You have a choice between the razor-sharp Spassky line and the more solid but, well, let's say safer line espoused by Turner and Geller. Before we leave the subject, I'm going to go all the way back to knight c3 castles. I should mention the move f3, which has also been played, another way for white to prevent knight g4. Then international master Andrew Greet recommends the very sharp move queen b6 in this position, trying to exploit white's slight lagging development and his hanging pieces on d4 and e3. Note that b2 is also en prise. This move could well cause confusion in white's camp, and white's probably got to move one of his knights here. This is an untested continuation. In fact, in the chess-based megabase with nearly 4.5 million games, I could not find a single game with this continuation. There are two lines. If white plays knight cb5, note the knight on d4 is pinned. Queen a5 check, And now, however white plays in this position, I think black gets reasonable chances. For instance, if he goes bishop d2, black goes queen d8. And it's doubtful whether white has anything better than playing bishop e3 in this position. If he insists on originality with queen c1, we have knight g4, f takes g4, knight takes d4. And suddenly the tables are turned in terms of pawn structure. Going back to the position after queen b6, if knight db5 here, then that's a terrible mistake. Black comes in and chops off the bishop on e3. Finally, after queen b6, white can try knight a4, but now queen a5 check, and if king f2 in this position, well, black can even get on the case with f5. This is a typical move for this way of playing, and exactly the move black wants to play. So if you feel, how can I put it, in a sharp mood against the Maroczy Bind, you can try this line. It is possible to play it in several different ways, as we've seen, and I imagine that this system will score pretty well for you in practical terms. I'm now going to go on to consider one of the main lines against the Maroczy, which is much more soundly based, but of course we're not playing for such high stakes.